All right, so today we start Shemot. So we start the book of Exodus. And just to say a few words in sort of introduction, what we've ended with in the last several parshayot is the story of Joseph, who's the last of the sort of the literal children of Israel. He's one of the last of the tribes. I guess Benjamin is the ultimate last one. And what we have there is really, and the beginning of Shemot with the names of all these folks who came down to Egypt, in some ways was the coalescence of the creation of the Hebrew people, the children of Israel, come down to Egypt and are going to have this experience together as the 12 tribes.
Is there a difference between the list that's in
Louder, we can't hear.
Is there a difference in the list that's in Shemot than there is at the end of Genesis? Bereshit, or is it identical?
No, well, there are two different lists. There actually, if you count, there are 14 tribes.
I'm not talking about the number of tribes. I'm talking about the names of all the people.
No, there is a difference.
We don't name every people.
Well,
Well, there were only 70 people. It's easy enough to name them.
There's
20,000 or something.
well, at the end, yeah. But when there's 12 tribes, those are 12 sons of Israel. Later on, Ephraim and Manasseh are added in. So Joseph drops out, and so does Levi, because Levi doesn't get an allocation of land. Well, there's two different lists of tribes.
No, I wasn't worried about the tribe. I was talking about the people themselves.
Oh, I think the names are the same. I don't remember for
They
sure.
had a roster of all 20.
Well, they're saying these are the sons. Yes, they did. Anyway, what we get in this book is with Moses and Moses' leadership, I think it's not the creation of the Hebrew people, but the creation of the Jewish people. So this is another kind of creation story of the people, not like we get with Jacob, Israel, and the 12 tribes, but with Moses and the however many 600,000 people, Sinai, and really a completely different group of people are coming out of Egypt than went in.
You, I think, might know the answer to this. It seems that they're like, from Shemot on is the history of the people.
Right.
Yeah, okay, the rest is like an introduction. Now, of course, the Orthodox, even we maintain this is all, well, the Orthodox, this is all done by God and whatnot. But it seems to me almost like it's two different stories that somebody tried to combine.
Yeah, well, I think there are two very different histories. One, like I said, one is the history of the Hebrews, the children of Israel, the literal children of Israel. Here, we really are looking at the history of the Jewish people. We're 400 years later or thereabouts, different leadership, a whole different story is now being told.
The government of the people of Israel.
They had a government.
No, I mean-
They lived in Egypt and they had their own government.
No, but as opposed to say Joseph and Abraham.
Well,
Here
that
they're-
was
they're
all
really,
just the family history.
that's a family and this is a national.
And this is a national, so I think there's a major jump here.
Right,
So-
for sure. Genesis is all about families, the patriarch, it's the family and the struggle to hold the family together. Now we're going to see the emergence of the nation.
Exactly.
But let me just say this, Robert Alter says here to answer Ron's question, the list of Jacob's sons harks back to the longer list of sons and grandsons at the moment of the descent into Egypt in Genesis 46, 8:20 to 8:27.
Yeah.
So he says the list of people was longer in Genesis.
Right, well, because you get the grandkids and maybe
Right.
even the great grandkids, yeah. So anyway, I think this very first part of Shemot, the sort of the names is our transition. So these are the folks who came back then. We're closing that chapter. We're now going through a whole new birth of the nation. And I think it's what I want to kind of do today is read through this story because there are lots of really intriguing little linguistic details in the story. But we're seeing the birth of the Jewish people. And so I want us to kind of have that in mind as we read this part of, this first parashah, that we're looking at the creation of something new. So, the introduction, let's say, or the transition ends, Joseph died and all his brothers and all that generation. Actually, it was several generations.
So what page are we in?
Oh, I'm sorry. In H. Chaim, we're page 318. 318. And we're just at the
Oh, yeah,
beginning
I
of
see.
Exodus. Yeah, like
Third book.
1:3, 1:4, 1:6, actually. So Joseph died, all his brothers died, all that generation. But the Israelites were fertile, prolific. They multiplied and increased very greatly so that the land was filled with them. Okay, so the stage is set, right?
3:18.
So actually, does somebody else want to read? We're at number 8, verse 8.
A new king,
Yeah,
a new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph.
okay, I want to stop here for a second. Very good. So what is it that the new king didn't know?
What was 400 years earlier?
Well,
Right,
not
Of course he
Yeah, I
did.
mean, that's what kind of business, I think it's a different dynasty. If David remembers the dynasty.
David would say that, yes.
David should, yeah, but,
well, yeah, it's the beginning of the new kingdom. It is. It's
but still, I mean, that they would not have
You would-
known anything about the history before them. I wonder today.
I'll throw it in if you want me to again, more specifically.
Oh, it's fine.
which
We've
is
heard
to
it.
Say that probably the Joseph pharaoh was a Hyksos pharaoh during the second intermediate period of Egyptian
Right.
history. Now you have the new kingdom, beginning with Seti the first and moving on with Ramses the second, etc. They certainly wouldn't have favored Asiatic, if you will, invaders or Asiatic Hyksos pharaohs. They're now a
That's okay,
restoration
but-
of native Egyptian pharaohs.
But David, wouldn't they at least have known that the person existed? That's all I'm asking.
I would have a hard time believing that it wasn't written in the archives.
For what
Now,
it's
whether they looked
worth,
it up, that's another story.
for what it's worth, even pharaohs of new dynasties within the new kingdom obliterated images of their predecessors and replaced those images with themselves. So it's not beyond reason to think that they would have done everything they could to obliterate whatever record there was.
okay.
Okay, that's
So,
possible.
so that gives us a kind of historical context, right? So Joseph comes, he basically saves Egypt, he gathers the grain for the 7 years, blah, 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 blah. He consolidates power. And this was the Egypt that the new kingdom inherits, right? Now we get a new king. If I recall correctly from my ancient Near history courses, this is when the kings started to be called pharaohs, was at this period. At any rate, and they want to forget that past. They want to start a new, a whole new beginning with the new kingdom. So I'm wondering if it means when he says he didn't know Joseph, he didn't acknowledge Joseph. He didn't acknowledge these people. Here are the Hebrews living in Goshen. They're living well off the land because of what Joseph did 400 years ago.
Yeah,
And he's saying, I'm not recognizing this, this pattern.
did he keep like the 7 years of storage and 7 years of use, I wonder?
Yeah, but that would have been almost 400 years ago, right?
Yeah, but still, it's a pattern that you hey, this works.
Right.
Rabbi, I think here's this is what we should see in the paragraph that we just read. And the
Okay.
sons of Israel were fruitful and swarmed and multiplied and grew very vast, and the land was filled with them. The Egyptians here, this is political. They see that the Israelites are a threat to them. Joseph served his purpose, okay? As you said, he consolidated the power of Pharaoh. He made it a total tyranny. It was a monarchy, basically. Now, this is a new era, and they're, in contrast to Genesis, where most of the matriarchs had such difficulty procreating, we see here now that it's a whole new thing. They're multiplying and producing, and it's an amazing contrast. But this is all
Right.
political now. They
Right.
don't care what happened before.
Yeah, Ivan has,
It's Nelson.
Nelson, I mean, yeah, they're ignoring
In relation to what,
David.
he said, the women, they're no longer discuss the wives really to any
Right.
extent. They're not important.
Right, right. Yeah, did you, Nelson, did you have something?
But he's
You're muted. He's been talking.
I think are you muted?
No, okay. Joseph called his ruler a Pharaoh. Pharaoh's
Huh?
come later. Why is this man called a king?
Yeah, I'm not sure unless we're just really in this, I don't know. Historically, that should be the other way around. They were kings. This is a pharaoh. I don't
I
know.
have a political comment to make. If this ruler sees the Hebrews as a potential enemy, and he's afraid that they might turn and side with people who invade and try to conquer Egypt, why does he make them an enemy? Why does he try and make them a friend? Why does he project hostility to them?
Good point.
Right.
I want to mention something about what Nelson said. A rabbi in this community told me once that this story of Pharaoh not recognizing Joseph, in spite of all the good things he has done for the country of Egypt,
Yeah.
should remind
For
us,
the what?
in spite of all the good things that Joseph did for the country of Egypt, should remind us of Jewish history in general,
Right.
and you know the rest.
Right. Well, so you have I was going to mention that later. You got the
Yeah.
rise of anti-Semitism here, all new king, new dynasty, right? New government.
Right.
Who are these people? Maybe they're enemies. Maybe not. How assimilated were they really after 400 years? And the answer here is, well, not so assimilated because they were still discriminated out.
And he specifically mentioned this, Rabbi, that look at how well Jews were off in the Weimar Germany
Right.
before and after.
Right.
It's just a new ruler that did not acknowledge them, did not recognize them, and suddenly is an enemy.
Right.
Whereas before, more or less the same people were not
Right.
enemy.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I should point out that on the verse before, when it says the children of Israel were fruitful and increased very greatly, the Hebrew word is yishritzu. In other words, they swarmed. That's the Egyptian perspective. They're like taking over this land.
Yeah.
Right. And are they going to replace us?
It goes back to the language of Genesis at the very beginning when God created the world.
Right.
Swarming things in the tohu,
Right.
vofu.
Right, so they preued and revued, right? They were fruitful and multiplied, but it adds in and they swarmed.
So that it's interesting because the Jews wrote this. Why did they write that word, add that
Right.
word? Because it's in such a negative
Right.
implication. Or was it not a negative, it may not have been a negative thing in those days, because the words, you know,
Or,
elevated or,
Right.
denigrated, I forgot what the other word is.
You know, but the truth is the Egyptians never liked the Jews. They wouldn't eat with them. They looked down on them. They
well, right now, we're not talking about Jews, we're talking about Hebrews still.
Well, the Hebrews. They were shepherds.
Asiatics,
They were
right? They were
shepherds.
Easterners.
Right.
But they didn't eat kosher yet, remember, they didn't have the Torah.
But anyway, but let's go on. So a king arose who did not know Joseph, which I think means he didn't acknowledge or recognize the status of the Hebrews anymore, right? And instead of seeing them as a helpful people or a helpful part of the community, they're a potential enemy, right? So go ahead, verse 9.
And he said to his people, look, the Israelite people are much too numerous for us. Let us deal shrewdly with them so that they may not increase. Otherwise, in the event of war, they may join our enemies in fighting against us and rise from the ground. So they set taskmasters over them to oppress them with forced labor, and they built garrison cities for Pharaoh, Pithom and Ramses. But the more they were oppressed, the more they increased and spread out, so that the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites.
I'd like to go back to verse 9 for a second.
Verse 9 for a second, okay?
Where it says B'nai Yisrael.
Yes,
That is the king or the pharaoh saying that B'nai Yisrael. So he knew, if he knew B'nai Yisrael, he had to have known Joseph.
right. He knew they were Israel, right? Even if.
Yeah, but this is going back even another generation. He
Right.
knew that they were the sons of Israel. He had to have known that Joseph was one of them and what he had done.
Yeah, well, it starts off saying.
It contradicts that he didn't know. That's all I'm
Oh,
trying to say.
I see what you're saying, yeah. Well, he could have called them Israel without realizing.
Yeah,
Well, maybe or maybe not. You don't
Right.
know.
He
Right.
didn't
All right.
want to acknowledge the role of Joseph, perhaps.
I think that's the point.
I think that's the
It's not,
That's
it's
the
not that
point.
he did not know him by name or
Of course
personally.
not.
He did not know the.
He didn't want to give him any credit, because then he would have had to accept the
100%.
Israel more.
Exactly. So if you discount Joseph, then the Israelites, like, who are they?
Yes,
And as it says, they swarmed and they rose from the ground. I mean, the language here is really interesting, right? What if they rise from the ground? So he's really talking about them like, what, lotus or grasshoppers or something. They're swarming and they're rising from the ground.
It's
That's interesting, because that is the image,
from
if they
the
use-
plagues.
but and later on also, don't they use that in connection with, when they go to Israel, to Canaan, the spies?
Yeah,
Yeah.
right. We're like grasshoppers, right?
So it's interesting that this whole image, I wonder if someone's written Bob Alter, I wonder, he might.
Yeah.
This kind of thing.
But I just want to point, because I think there's a little bit anomalies in the language, these details, which seem to indicate something's going on, right?
Also, that there's a different person totally from book one, from
Right.
Genesis.
So, all right, should we go on?
Yep. Try.
Did you say what you wanted to say about it?
Yeah, well,
I went back.
right, no, but that's what I was going to point out, that it's, what do they rise from the ground? And I thought this goes back to the Yishratsu, that they were swarm. And it's almost like they are a plague, locusts or grasshoppers or whatever it is. Just the language has that sense about it.
Amazing.
Yeah. All right, somebody else want to read? We're at 13.
So Lee does a good job, let it do it.
Go. Lee, go.
Oh, I
13.
thought you did something else, sorry. The Egyptians ruthlessly imposed upon the Israelites the various labors that they made them perform. Ruthlessly, they made life bitter for them. with harsh labor and mortar and bricks and with all sorts of tasks in the field.
All right, which raises your question, like if you're worried about these people, why not assimilate them in instead of oppress them and push them out, right?
Because that makes them weaker.
Maybe.
Because what?
And
It makes them weaker,
on the other hand, there are still a group.
right?
So that is an interesting point. Then it sort of indicates then that he did know these people and something, or similar people, similar groups,
Right.
and that they could be a danger.
If he tried to assimilate them, then he would have been too benevolent. This way, he is oppressing them and is using their labor for free. That's a better deal,
Right.
I would think.
I mean, the other thing he could have done is expelled them, right? Taken over the land, pushed them out, go back to Canaan where you came from.
There may have been too many.
There were probably too many. And economically, at this point, they must have been significant.
Yeah, I was gonna say the labor is more.
Also, it reminds me
But they
that
were
in
still
those
presumably
days,
in Goshen.
Huh?
Were they still just in Goshen? They're
Well,
now all over the place.
they may have swarmed all over the place. I don't know.
It's interesting what questions are left out.
I mean, are they, what are they doing? Are they still all farmers and shepherds up in Goshen watching their sheep and goats? Like, who cares? Maybe the whole swarming and raising up all over the land means they spread out. They've gone on the countryside. They're farmers, they're merchants, they're,
And some of them would have assimilated.
exactly.
But it says they were oppressed and were used to build things.
So he's pulled them out and, what do you call it, corvée, forced labor, which is a tax, and he's specifically calling them out.
One of
And
the
I think-
things, though, that you have here, it seems to me, now I'll admit that this is coming in a context of living in the time in which we live, after the Holocaust, etc. But you have a new kingdom that's ethnically Egyptian. You have a
Right.
bunch of people who are more ethnically related to the prior intermediate period kings who were not ethnically Egyptian. The ethnically Egyptian king says to the ethnic Egyptians, we don't want to assimilate these people. They're not us. They're the other. Moreover, we have to worry that they would join with people who are also Asiatic or Semitic against us if there were a war. And
Right.
there seem to be a whole lot of them, whether there are or not. Not unlike surveys of anti-Semites in this country who say that they believe the Jews are about 30% of the population and growing.
And we own all the banks and the media.
But you raise another interesting point, which hopefully we'll get to, well, we may not. Can you tell, I don't know how to say this, a Hebrew from an Egyptian? Well, I'll jump ahead. Remember later on when Moses meets the priest, the Midianite priest, and the daughter goes and he helps the daughters at the well, it's coming up. And she goes back home, and I'll give a loose translation. Hey, Pops, there's this Egyptian dude who helped me. For her, Moses was an Egyptian. So how different did they look from each other? Did he maybe speak with an Egyptian accent? Was he wearing Egyptian clothes? Did he look like an Egyptian?
Well, if he
Yeah.
grew up and lived his whole life there, of course.
In the court?
Yeah, but Moshe would have been a separate from everybody else because he did grow up in the court.
Yeah, I think we have to
So
come back to
But I mean, one of the reasons they say that the Israelites, the Hebrews, whichever, came through the Exodus or were saved was because they didn't give up their language or their clothing. And they still named their by names,
right.
Hebrew names.
Yeah, and
I mean,
remember,
but of course,
And Moses-
that's Midrash, of course.
Well,
Moses was in the court, and Joseph was in the court.
Right.
Moses was not really important in the court the way Joseph was. But the parallel story,
There are parallels, and I want to kind of get back to that too. Let's go on and read, where we're at 15.
Yeah.
15, I thought, okay, the king of Egypt spoke to the
Now it's back to king again.
Yeah,
Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shiphrah and the other Puah.
now let me just point out that these are Semitic names, not Egyptian names.
I'm sure.
When you deliver the Hebrew women, look at the birth stool. If it is a boy, kill him. If it is a girl, let her live.
I want to ask you about the logic of this. If you're using these people as builders and slaves, wouldn't you want the males and not the females?
Well, that's what he,
Wouldn't you have wanted?
If you're using them as like slave labor, you'd want the males, right, not the females.
But if he's.
But the argument of they are reproducing too much is much stronger than we need them as labor.
Okay, is that how we read the sentence? Yeah.
What I guess, if he's worried that they were gonna rise up against him, then he wants it.
That's exactly the point,
But you're
yeah.
right, from the standpoint.
Yeah.
So you'd rather have a bunch of women rise up than a bunch of men.
Yeah,
Well,
well, I mean, just, presumably go through the strength. But they
Women-
could,
Okay, well, I just wanted to point out, it seems like you would immediately think the other way around.
Slave. They were house slaves.
They're house slaves, right?
Besides,
And nursemaids. and-
besides which, what we don't know is just what kind of, sexual habits they had. In other words, were they interested in the women perhaps as concubines or as,
Yeah. Oh, I would guess.
prostitutes,
but
something
ever
like-
since in human history from way, way back, boys were more valuable than girls. And those are the ones who an emperor like Pharaoh would have wanted to
Right.
take out, and not the females.
Which then raises, if they're interested in the women because the women can be, prostitutes or concubines or whatever, what's the status of the children? There's no answer here, but I just,
There's no
Huh?
maid.
Take them over as slaves.
I mean, in Jewish law, they would be Jewish, but,
Right.
but I don't know how.
but we're in Israelite law right now. I don't know.
did they have Talmudic law back then?
No.
Yeah,
I
but
mean,
the
I'm wondering what the
trans-
Egyptians thought.
Right, I don't know what their rules were.
Right. Well, let's go on with Moses, because I think it says more about this kind of thing.
Let me just say, as far as Shiphrah and Puah go, the translation is deliberately ambiguous, it seems, because it can be translated as Hebrew midwives or midwives of the Hebrews.
Right.
What's the Hebrew?
Hamiyaldot ha'ivriot. So it could be Hebrew midwives or midwives of the Hebrews.
Right. And
Said the names were
But the names tell us they're Semitic.
right, but there's a deliberate ambiguity here, and Jonathan Sachs says the reason for that is that the Shiphrah and Puah become symbols of civil disobedience, of a superior morality, because they defy the king's orders, and that special moral quality transcends any race or ethnic group.
Well, whatever, but at least on the surface of the story, they're clearly Hebrew, or at least Asiatic. They do not have,
The comments are very interesting in Eitz Chaim about the names.
yeah. All right, keep going. If it's a boy, kill him. If it's
So the
a,
king of Egypt summoned the midwives and said to them, "Why have you done this thing, letting the boys live?" And the midwives said to Pharaoh, "Because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women. They are vigorous. Before the midwife can come to them, they have given birth." And God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and increased greatly. And because the midwives feared God, he established households for them. Then Pharaoh charged all his people, saying, "Every boy that is born you shall throw into the Nile, but let every girl live."
all right, so what's happening here?
Well,
This is the sociological picture.
The midwives are finding an excuse, saying this is why we let the boys live, because before we could get to the woman who's ready to give birth, they have already given birth. We
Right.
don't have a handle on it.
And what do we, yeah,
Right, and so the midwives, it says that the midwives feared God. So they acknowledged God, and because in return, God treated them well by giving
And?
them their own households.
what does
And-
that mean? What does that mean?
Well, one interpretation is that you became a midwife when you couldn't bear your own children. And so
Okay.
now they assisted in helping the Israelites, and God gave them their own households, which also equal families. So now that they could have their own children. That's another midrash.
Okay, so,
so it says, why does it even talk about the midwives if the Hebrew women gave birth before the midwives could get there?
yeah. First of all, for the Hebrew midwives to say, yeah, we can't get there in time, like, really? Then I need to get new midwives. What do you,
9 months isn't enough time to get.
yeah, I mean, we had no woman show up, was pregnant, gave birth. What did,
It's an excuse. What may be more startling is that Pharaoh buys the excuse. Does
That's where
that
I'm
say
going,
that
like-
Pharaoh is so disconnected from his own slaves that such an excuse could be bought so easily?
right, exactly. Yeah, Nelson, did you have something?
Yeah, I'm curious about they claim that they're perfectly willing to kill the fetus, but not the child. As if being born changes the moral status of what's happening.
Good point, yeah,
Interesting in light of what happens today.
yeah. No, but I think Nelson raises a good point, so that women get there and the mother had just given birth 3 hours ago, they got stuck in traffic. If anybody been in Cairo, the traffic's horrible,
The
right?
camels.
They were in Goshen.
They were in Goshen, right?
They were in
Anyway,
the suburbs. It took longer to get.
they couldn't
It's
kill the
called
baby.
Goshen, but it was really Stopshin.
Yeah, they couldn't kill the baby then.
Well, the mother already saw that it was alive. That was the difference.
Well, then you take it out and you come back and said, oh, it stopped breathing. We don't know what to do. I mean, there are ways of doing that more credibly than, oh, we can never get there on time.
Well,
Right?
it's
So, I mean, Pharaoh had to, or somebody in Pharaoh's court had to have enough smarts to say, these women are letting the baby boys live. And how could they do that? And God knew they were letting the baby boys live, and so made them fertile, according to that interpretation, right? So, I mean, this is an open secret. These Asiatic midwives are disobeying Pharaoh.
All right, we have this today. The president, the king, well,
the king.
yeah, will say something. He wants something done,
Right.
but he doesn't carry through on it. That he leaves to his underlings. And, you know, they say something, I mean, when you talk about the border, the president, and it's both of us, it was Trump and Biden, they say one thing and then another thing is really happening. And they can't control
but
everything.
let me push that a step further. So what Pharaoh or the king is worried about is the Hebrews, you know, that are swarming and are going to start disobeying him and maybe join his enemies. And what happens? They start disobeying him. He was right. No?
And the thing is that it might not have happened if he had not.
Got up, right?
But then we wouldn't be where we are.
Well, that's another whole theological, right? But you're right, if the Pharaoh had just shut up, but he saw that they were going to rise up, or he understood that they might, and he tried to impose restrictions on them, and guess what? They rose up.
Maybe one day we will find more out, because they keep finding all these pyramids and the works, you know, writings in them.
Right. But anyway, I just want to point also that out, that actually this new Pharaoh who didn't know Joseph was sort of correct. And when he tried to control the swarming people, they rose up. They didn't rise up. I mean, they disobeyed.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's part one. So chapter 2, and this is the part I really wanted to talk about, which is Moses.
Oh, Moses.
Moses comes into the story.
Certain man of the house of Levi went and married a Levite woman. The woman conceived and bore a son, and when she saw how beautiful he was, she hid him for 3 months. When she could hide him no longer, she got a wicker basket for him and caulked it with bitumen and pitch. She put the child into it and placed it among the reeds by the bank of the Nile. And his sister stationed herself at a distance to learn what would befall him.
Okay,
I think what's interesting here is that this man married this woman and had this son,
yeah,
and there's no mention of the first 2 children.
right. All of a sudden, a sister.
All of a sudden, we're on the 3rd child.
Right. All of a sudden, there's a sister, and apparently a somewhat older sister. I mean,
Yes, she had to
Okay,
be.
it had to be. I think the midrash is she was 10, but I don't know.
whatever.
Yeah,
Oh.
but also that she had the courage to have a child after Pharaoh made his decree.
Right. And to hide well, first of all, we know the midwives didn't get there in time, right?
Well,
And
they'd already stopped
But they
doing that.
don't mention it,
yeah,
but they don't mention it, which is interesting.
right. She just had a child. She hid it for 3 months.
Well, that's because that proclamation had been discarded already because a new proclamation is throw them in the river. So it didn't matter if they got.
So wait, so remember now, Pharaoh, when Pharaoh discovers that the midwives can't arrive on time, he tells the people, right? If you see a Hebrew boy, throw him in the Nile, right?
It was a new.
That's 22, verse 22. Then Pharaoh charged all his people being Egyptians, I assume. Every boy that is born you shall throw into the Nile, and let every girl live. So what does the mom do here?
She hides the
She hides.
baby.
And then
Throws him in the river.
throws him in the Nile.
She did exactly what she was told.
Right.
We would call it child abuse today.
Right.
Right.
But
Except she
now,
puts
look
them in a basket or a teva, so a
Right.
little bit of a chance for him anyway, as it turns out, a
Right,
big
right.
chance.
Right. And she stations Miriam there to watch
Right.
out for him.
We didn't read that yet.
Right. But I just wanted to point that, and I think the commentary says, yeah, the wicker basket, oh, I'm thinking of the ark, you know, and this is a new, you can think of this as the river, as the flood, and we've got a new birth here, a new beginning. I don't know if you want to call the Nile a birth canal, and this is Moses' birth,
It looks like one. Oh, no, the Red Sea, the.
Reed Sea.
does.
The
Yeah,
Reed Sea was considered the birth canal.
yeah, so there, I think there's more going on here. This is quite a literary construct that we've got in these chapters. That we no longer know Joseph, but we do know Moses, who's a new birth and a new people. Right?
And Rabbi, if you want to take your simile, if you will, a little bit further, the interesting thing is he's going to be called Moses, which is a Egyptian name.
Right.
So that's an interesting kind of rebirth once he ends up in the palace, and it plays into this sort of historical idea that a tyrant always worries that his supplanter is out there somewhere. And Moses doesn't supplant Pharaoh, but he does take the slaves out.
Right. Right. Which is what Pharaoh should have done but didn't do. Right.
Like throw them out of the country.
Throw him out of the country, yeah. And yes, Moses is an Egyptian name. You see it at the ending of some of the Pharaoh names. Moses, Tut Moses, Ram Moses. We call it Ramses because the Greeks messed it up, but presumably,
Well, going back to when, we're jumping forward, when Moshe was in Midian and whatever her name was, saw him
yeah,
and said this Egyptian, he had an Egyptian name. He was probably wearing Egyptian clothes. He probably spoke both Egyptian and Hebrew,
right.
or whatever it was called back then. So you could easily mistake him as an Egyptian.
Right. And so that's why I'm asking a question. Did the Egyptians these people who had lived there for 400 years, could you have really distinguished them on the street? Right? Except for their clothing or for whatever.
In the pictures, in the hieroglyphics. Now, I don't know which era they are, but some of them, they always say the Semitic ones have the little beard.
Right. But
I don't
again,
know
you've got
which
people
old they are. They may not have been from this time.
You've got people who've been living in Goshen, right, in the land for 400 years at this point. Right? How could they not be assimilated?
Because there weren't that many
Well, I mean,
non-Hebrews there.
Because this country, are we assimilated or are we not assimilated? Because I know all the men are wearing tzitzit so you can tell them apart, and all the women are wearing shaitos so you can tell them apart.
Right.
Yeah, right. You can't tell us apart if you see us walking down the street.
And if you're
But yet we still are separate.
you go in Israel, there are all kinds of people on the street. You don't know who's Jewish, who's Arab, who's Christian, who's Muslim, who's Circassian, who's
And
Turkish.
Remember,
Ethiopian.
You can tell.
I grew up in the South. We're really sensitive to that.
remember the Israelites ate lamb and beef, meat, and the Egyptians were vegetarians. Not only that, they worshiped things like cows and so forth. And that really set them apart.
Whatever, but at any rate, so where are we now? So Pharaoh has said, get rid of all the Hebrew boys. She puts them in this river. She floats them down in an ark, right? And Pharaoh's household sees them and must recognize he's a Hebrew. And
How could they recognize that he's a Hebrew?
Because they didn't throw the Egyptians into the map.
for one thing,
He could have been circumcised.
oh, maybe he was circumcised.
This is, no, it isn't.
Did they have that then?
Yeah, they did.
Yeah, it started with Abraham.
Abraham went through that little process.
That little process.
So let's go on with verse.
They didn't circumcise them because of,
No, actually, they didn't, because when they were in the desert, they all were circumcised.
No, the Egyptians circumcised. So it wouldn't have
No,
made it.
but the Hebrews didn't. They circumcised them in the desert.
Yeah, but he was raised.
Later, everybody.
That's right. They went through a whole mass.
So they weren't doing circumcision.
they were or weren't.
They were not.
May not have, yeah. Well, let's go on
I
with five
think it's
because
a little more complicated than that. It's that they were, and then they weren't, perhaps for whatever reason, and then they did again. That would be most consistent with the text, I think.
yeah, yeah,
The daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe in the Nile while her maidens walked along the Nile. She spied the basket among the reeds and sent her slave girl to fetch it. When she opened it, she saw that it was a child, a boy, crying. She took pity on it and said, "This must be a Hebrew child."
all right, how did she know? I don't know, but anyway.
Who else would put a kid in a newborn in the basket?
She was
One of the
brighter than
other
her father.
people that they oppressed at the time.
Yeah, it seems like she knew about the decree. That,
You would think,
that.
Right, and
usually-
this,
Nile.
this follows the theme of the midwives. They took pity to also, she's also taking pity on this child. And this is obviously Pharaoh's daughter, which is amazing that she is going to disobey her own father, and it's a big risk for her.
right. And
Well,
she knows,
And he had to know about it too eventually.
And not only that, she names Moses. Pharaoh's daughter names Moses.
right. And she gives him a royal name with the Moses ending, which means child of or descendant of or something like that. He must have had you wonder if he had an Egyptian god name as the first half of his name. Like Tut Moses, the born of Tut or Ram's Moses. And then later on, we drop, obviously, the Egyptian part of the name and the God, the deity part of the name, and he just ends up with the last half. Anyway. So she knows what's going on, and yet she takes the child in. Keep going.
Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and get you a Hebrew nurse to suckle the child for you?" And Pharaoh's daughter answered yes. So the girl went and called the child's mother. And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this child and nurse it for me, and I will pay your wages." So the woman took the child and nursed it.
That's the mother now, right?
Yes. When the child grew up, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, who made him her son. She named him Moses, explaining, "I drew him out of the water."
Okay.
So keep
It would be
going.
interesting to know what the mother was calling him while she was nursing him for however many years that was.
Right. No name? Or
Baby boy.
baby boy, yeah.
So keep going.
He didn't have an Olivia yet to name him.
Right.
Then
Well,
circumcised yet.
Pharaoh's daughter is the ultimate righteous Gentile.
Right.
But she has this,
Who brought down an entire empire.
Right. So much for righteousness. Huh?
Uh-huh.
she has an interest in this. She doesn't know what she's gonna find in the butcher basket.
Right. I'm
She
imagining,
suddenly occurs to her that she never seems to get married.
right.
But we
And
don't
you've got to
know.
wonder, she goes out bathing as a nice virgin daughter, and she comes back with a baby. What?
No, she didn't come back with the baby.
No, she gave the baby to the.
Oh, the baby went back to mom's house.
Yeah.
Baby went back to mom's house. Of course, the question, that's the interesting thing, because then if an Egyptian had found the baby at mom's house, he could take the baby and kill the baby,
Thrown it in the Nile, right.
throw it back into the
Right.
Nile or something. And she would say, no, this baby belongs to the princess.
Right. Would
Right,
she-
and along those lines, this is another stunning act by Miriam, that she has the courage to approach Pharaoh's daughter and suggest what she does. So here's, and by the way, you see look at the theme, look at the narrative thread. All of these people are women that are showing compassion and pity, and there's going to be more.
Right. It's the women who carry the story. Yeah, that's where I was going to end up with.
The same, in Breshit.
No, very different. This is very, yeah, this is very different. Here, it's the midwives, it's, the
Miriam should suddenly appear would be enough for the princess to think, okay, this has got to be a Hebrew, and okay, do what you have to do. Because I mean, why is Miriam suddenly there?
Because she was watching.
No, we know why she's there. But I mean, as far as the princess is concerned, the baby in there, and yet there's a,
this woman pops out of the bushes, right?
Together,
Girl.
Right.
This girl pops out of the bushes and says,
yeah.
Woman's nursing it just out of the bushes.
And what would have happened, I mean, and how is the baby going to survive if the princess had not found him?
right.
Miriam might have taken.
Mary might have picked him up later on, yeah. Oh, look what I found.
What I find interesting, I mean, this is interesting, but what I find interesting is verse 10. Why did it only says she, so I don't know if it's Miriam or Yocheved. Why did she willingly, without being prodded, give the kid back to the princess?
Right. Right. She could have said,
Because
oh,
as soon as she did that, there were a couple reasons. I mean, a couple things. One is, why did she willingly do it without being prodded? And number two, as soon as she gave him up, she stopped getting her wages. Right? I mean, why would anybody in the right mind do that?
well, the child was weaned, I assume is what it's saying.
Yeah, well, sure, but why, still, so what?
A few days.
Maybe she forgot about it. It's 3 years later.
Well, I mean, this raises another whole question. At this point, are there no Hebrew males around?
What do you mean?
Well, you're supposed to throw all the male kids into the river. So at some point, there are no males, like under 10 or whatever.
But did they really do it? We don't know.
Right.
There's nothing says that they did it.
We don't know, but we can presume that there were the males who were old enough already to have not been thrown in the river to begin with.
You would think.
However, they're getting older and older, so maybe at some point Pharaoh says, all right, let some of the males live because we still need workers.
Right.
None of that is said explicitly. I think the more interesting question, Ron, is not why would the mother give the child back, because I think that would be, if the Pharaoh's daughter says, hey, let me finish, please. If the Pharaoh's daughter says, give me the child back now that it's weaned, is a slave woman going to not give the child back, even if it's hard for her? What I think is
agree
more
with you, but I
interesting is
said,
why does Pharaoh
I said she did it.
Why
I
does
said she
Pharaoh
did it without being
accept
prodded.
this,
There's no pride.
adopted son who's probably for sure a Hebrew?
Yeah.
I think a mother always wants better for her son. And it's very easy, during the Holocaust, the mothers sent their kids to England rather than, so maybe she didn't want her son to become a slave and be the life that she had.
And he's got his chance of going to the, Pharaoh's private school and raised in the castle. Yeah.
Maybe she
Right, so-
remembered the story of Joseph and thought it would be another.
Right, so, but we also know that, 80 years after this episode, we know that there were Hebrews, I get it right. There were Hebrews, men of much younger age, because otherwise there would be nobody to take out.
Yeah.
So they obviously immediately stopped killing, maybe not immediately, but eventually they stopped killing the baby boys.
All right, so we're almost at 10 o'clock. I just want to read one more verse because I think this raises a whole huge question, which we won't discuss. Sometime after that, when Moses had grown up, he went out to his kinsfolk, his brothers is what the Hebrew says, Echav, and witnessed their labors. Yeah, so there's a bunch of them out there laboring. And now I was going to ask the question here, if we had more than 90 seconds, when it says he went out to his brothers, that Moses know these were his kinsmen.
Well, they said before that his mother used to tell him, she was teaching him Hebrew nursery rhymes, she was
Yeah, right.
drilling him.
Maybe, but they
Okay,
are
but-
clearly his brothers are around, they're laboring. And like you say, later on, he leads out this huge mass of people. Some of them had to have been born.
Yeah.
Right. So,
Well, and the going back to it about the achi, there's later texts where in some of the mitzvot, where achi could be brother, it could be kinsman, it could be neighbors, it could be whoever lives with you.
It could be people he
it's
emphasized.
It's indiscriminate, so it could be anybody here.
yeah, it's clearly not his brothers, but it could be his people, his kin, people he empathized with. I don't know.
Also, an important point here is that the fact that Moses is brought up in the Pharaoh's household means that he did not suffer a slave mentality, as you mentioned.
Right.
That he was whole, this is one of the reasons that perhaps God chooses Moses to be the leader.
No, I think it's the other way. He was chosen in utero.
Anyway, but anyway, my point was that this little part of the story of what happened after Joseph, the new Pharaoh, there are details in the language which I think open up whole possibilities of interpretation. This is a very tightly written story with lots of little details, and the details tell us a lot more than what's on the surface.
Right.
So that's why
Right.
kind
And
of
one thing about Joseph to end, it raises the question of, Joseph did some good things, but his vision was very limited. He couldn't see that what he was doing, consolidating power for the Pharaoh, for the king, to expand slavery or serfdom, that this would end up being a bad thing for the Israelites. Couldn't see that. This was a flaw in Jacob and Joseph, and it shouldn't be forgotten.
Right, and that's why I think here, Moses, we have a total new beginning, a whole new birth, a whole new person, a whole new people. And the old story is nice history. I think our story as Jews starts here. And the rest is prelude. All right, well, Shabbat Shalom. Thank you for your participation. Thank you all out there in Zoom land.